Sleep deprivation is a highly specific, uniquely agonizing form of psychological torture. It does not announce itself with a sudden crash, but rather creeps in through the floorboards, hollowing out your patience until the mere sound of a dropping pin feels like a personal insult. 8 months ago, I dragged 6 dozen cardboard boxes up a narrow flight of stairs into a second-floor unit of a pre-war Boston brownstone. The apartment was everything I had spent years saving for. Exposed brick walls, original crown molding, and heavy oak floors that carried the distinct, polished scent of age. It was meant to be my sanctuary, a quiet place to build my life. But within the first 3 weeks, I realized my sanctuary had a soundtrack, and the DJ lived directly beneath me. It was never the thunderous bass of a college party, nor the chaotic shouting of domestic disputes. It was more insidious. Every evening, starting precisely at 7 o'clock, the muffled, mid-Atlantic drawls of classic cinema leaked up through my floorboards. I could actually track the plotlines of black and white detective movies through the oak planks. The volume was just loud enough that I could make out the sharp crack of a cinematic gunshot, or the low, gravelly voice of a hard-boiled detective interrogating a suspect. Then came the nightly ritual. At 11 o'clock, without fail, there would be a heavy, dragging sound. A deep, resonant asterisk scrape thump that vibrated up through the soles of my feet. It sounded exactly like someone pulling a lead-filled armoire across an uncarpeted floor, pausing for breath, and then pushing it back. I am not a confrontational person. The mere thought of knocking on a stranger's door to complain sends a cold prickle of dread down my spine. I loathed the idea of becoming that neighbor, the perpetually annoyed upstairs tenant who bangs on the radiator with a wrench. So I suffered in silence. I bought earplugs that made my ear canals ache. I ran a white noise machine that sounded like a vacuum cleaner struggling to swallow a rug. I waited, convincing myself that the phase would pass, that whoever lived below me was just rearranging their living room in agonizingly slow increments. But it didn't pass. The breaking point arrived on a violently rainy Tuesday night. I had a massive presentation at my architectural firm the next morning, the kind of career-defining pitch that required sharp wits and a rested mind. At midnight, just as I was drifting into a fragile sleep, the muffled sound of a televised car chase erupted through the floor, followed immediately by the agonizing asterisk scrap of heavy wood groaning against the floor below. I sat up, my pulse drumming against my collarbone. The sheer exhaustion bypassed my social anxiety and mutated directly into exhausted resolve. I threw off the duvet, marched into the kitchen, and tore a sheet of paper from a legal pad. I spent 20 minutes agonizing over the tone. Dear neighbor felt too bureaucratic. Hey asterisk felt too familiar. I settled on a polite, neutral opening, writing carefully in black ink. I explained that I wasn't sure if he was aware of how thin the floors were, specifically mentioning the television volume and the late-night furniture moving. I kept the language incredibly soft, asking if we could perhaps figure out a compromise, and signed off with my apartment number. Tying my bathrobe tight, I crept down the dimly lit, carpeted stairwell. The brownstone smelled of damp wool and old brass. I stopped in front of Unit 1B, slipping the folded paper underneath the heavy oak door. I scurried back upstairs like a thief, my chest tight, with a sickening cocktail of relief and immediate regret. I crawled back into bed, fully expecting either a passive-aggressive escalation in noise or complete, icy silence. 3 days dragged by. The noise continued, albeit slightly softer, but I received no response. I resigned myself to the fact that I was now officially in a silent war with my downstairs neighbor. Then, on Friday morning, I opened my door to head to the office and stepped on a crisp, white envelope. My breath caught. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the sharp crease of the paper. Inside was a handwritten note on thick, cream-colored stationery. The handwriting was neat, architectural, and slanted heavily to the right. Dear upstairs, the note began, I am mortified. I genuinely had no idea the sound was carrying up to you. I am completely deaf in my right ear from a childhood infection, and my left isn't doing too hot either. I've been turning the television up just to hear the dialogue, completely oblivious to the fact that I was broadcasting Humphrey Bogart into your bedroom. I leaned against the doorframe, a sharp pang of guilt immediately replacing my lingering annoyance. The letter continued, I've just ordered a Bluetooth soundbar system that will let me use a wireless headset at night. It arrives tomorrow. As for the dragging, I restore antique furniture as a side business. Clamping and moving heavy dressers is apparently a very loud hobby. I've bought thick felt pads for everything in the shop and will strictly observe a 9 p.m. cutoff for any heavy lifting. But it was the bottom of the page that caught me off guard. More than anything, I want to say thank you. You could have easily gone to the building management and filed a formal noise complaint, which most people do without ever giving the offender a chance to fix the issue. I appreciate you treating me like a human being. Please let me know if I ever disturb you again. Sincerely, Cormac. I stood in my narrow hallway reading the thick, dark ink twice. The sheer, disarming maturity of the response made me feel both incredibly relieved and a little foolish for waiting 8 months to speak up. That evening, the silence from Unit 1B was absolute. No cinematic gunfire. No scraping wood, just the quiet hum of the city outside my window. It was exactly what I had wanted, yet the sudden absence of the noise left a strange, hollow ringing in my ears. The following morning, Saturday, the coastal rain returned, washing the Boston streets in a glossy steel-gray sheen. I walked 3 blocks down to a local artisanal roaster, purchased a bag of ridiculously expensive dark roast espresso beans, and walked back. My palms were sweating against the paper bag. I walked past my own floor, stopping in front of Unit 1B before I could overthink it. I knocked twice. A moment later, the deadbolt clicked. The door swung inward, revealing a man who looked absolutely nothing like the inconsiderate phantom I had constructed in my head. Cormac was tall, perhaps late 20s, with dark, unruly hair that looked as though it had been repeatedly pushed back by frustrated hands. He wore a faded gray Henley and a heavy canvas apron dusted with sawdust. A smudge of dark wood stain marked the angle of his jaw. His eyes, a sharp, clear hazel, widened slightly as he took me in. "Hi," I said, my voice embarrassingly tight. "I'm Briony from upstairs." His posture immediately shifted. A slow, deeply apologetic smile broke across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Briony. The woman I've been unintentionally tormenting." He stepped back, gesturing awkwardly to his right ear. "I'd invite you to yell at me, but you'd have to stand on my left side to do it." A laugh startled out of me, breaking the tension entirely. "I didn't come to yell. I came to apologize for assuming you were just being a jerk and to say thank you for the note." I held out the bag of coffee, a peace offering. Cormac looked at the bag, then up at me, his smile softening into something warmer. "You're bribing the guy who kept you awake. That's terrible negotiation tactics, Briony, but I accept." He stepped aside, pulling the door open wider. "Do you want to come in? I can prove the felt pads are real. And I can brew this right now. My espresso machine is arguably the only modern piece of machinery I own." I hesitated for only a fraction of a second before stepping over the threshold. His apartment was a mirror image of mine in layout, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Where my space was minimalist and modern, his was a chaotic, beautiful sanctuary of craftsmanship. The air smelled intensely of beeswax, old cedar, and lemon oil. Half-finished wooden chairs hung from hooks on the wall, and in the center of the living room sat a massive, beautifully carved mahogany credenza, its legs heavily wrapped in thick gray felt. "This was the culprit," Cormac said, tapping the heavy wood of the credenza. "I was trying to align the bottom joints late at night. I genuinely thought the oak floors absorbed the sound. It sounded like you were hiding bodies in a sarcophagus," I admitted, taking a seat on a velvet armchair he pointed to. Cormac laughed, a rich, genuine sound that seemed to fill the room without piercing it. He moved to the small kitchenette, his movements precise and practiced as he loaded the espresso machine. We spent the next 2 hours sitting in his sawdust-dusted living room, drinking strong coffee and talking as the rain lashed against the tall windows. I learned that he worked as an archivist for a local museum by day and restored discarded historical pieces by night. He learned about my grueling architectural firm, my obsession with structural integrity, and my absolute inability to function without a solid 8 hours of sleep. He was effortlessly witty, wildly intelligent, and possessed a quiet sort of confidence that completely disarmed me. When I finally excused myself to go back upstairs, the silence of my own apartment suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like an empty box. The dynamic of the building shifted entirely after that rainy Saturday. The oppressive noise was gone, replaced by a new, secret language between the floors. If I was working late at my drafting table, I would sometimes hear 2 soft, distinct taps on the radiator pipe. A few minutes later, I would find a small Tupperware of whatever dinner he had cooked sitting patiently in front of my door. In return, when I noticed the mail carrier had left a heavy package of brass fittings on the stoop, I would drag it inside and leave it in front of 1B with a sticky note bearing a terrible architecture pun. Weeks bled into months. The polite neighborly exchange naturally evolved into intentional lingering. Lingering in the hallway turned into shared dinners. Shared dinners turned into movie nights, this time in my apartment, where we watched the very same noir films that used to keep me awake. Only now I sat pressed against his side on the sofa, the dialogue playing at a perfectly reasonable volume. The definitive shift, the moment the final wall between us dissolved, happened during a brutal winter storm in late January. The wind was howling off the harbor, rattling the old window panes of the brownstone. Around 10 at night, the power grid gave out. The entire building plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. I was scrambling in my kitchen, blindly searching through drawers for a flashlight I knew I hadn't bought batteries for, when a knock sounded at my door. I opened it to find Cormac standing in the hallway, illuminated by the warm, flickering glow of an antique kerosene lantern he was holding. The golden light cast sharp shadows across the planes of his face, making him look like something out of a Victorian painting. "Checking on the upstairs management," he said softly, his breath pluming in the suddenly freezing air of the hallway. "You have heat." "Radiators are dead," I shivered, pulling my oversized cardigan tighter around my chest. "Same downstairs." He held up the lantern, and from his other hand he produced a heavy wool blanket. "I have exactly one source of light, half a bottle of decent bourbon, and a concerning amount of body heat. You are welcome to all three if you don't want to freeze in the dark." I stepped aside, letting him in. We set up camp on my living room rug, wrapped in the heavy wool blanket, the kerosene lantern casting a halo of amber light around us. The storm raged outside, throwing icy sleet against the glass, but inside the air felt thick and charged. We passed the bottle of bourbon back and forth, our voices dropping to hushed whispers, sharing stories about our childhoods, our failures, the quiet terrors of trying to build a life in a city that never stops moving. At some point, the conversation faded. The silence stretched out between us, but it wasn't the agonizing, tense silence I used to endure while staring at the ceiling. It was heavy, expectant, and warm. Cormac turned to look at me. In the lantern light, his hazel eyes were incredibly dark. He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against my cheek, tracing the line of my jaw with the same careful, reverent touch he used on his fragile antiques. "I'm really glad you slid that note under my door, Briony," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that I felt more than heard. "I'm glad you didn't throw it away," I whispered back. When he kissed me, it was slow, deliberate, and tasted faintly of smoke and bourbon. The storm outside entirely vanished. There was only the warmth of his hands, the solid weight of him leaning into me, and the overwhelming realization that the very thing that had disrupted my peace had somehow become the only place I wanted to rest. Sometimes we build fortresses out of our anxieties. We convince ourselves that reaching out, that communicating our discomfort, will only lead to conflict or rejection. We suffer in silence, assuming the absolute worst of the strangers around us, building walls of resentment over things that could be dismantled with a single, polite conversation. But human beings are more often than not just waiting for the chance to be decent. Sometimes, being the person who takes a deep breath, steps out of their comfort zone, and leaves a polite note doesn't just solve a problem. Sometimes it opens a door you didn't even know was closed, leading you exactly to where you were always meant to be. If you enjoyed this story, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new narrative. Leave a comment below telling me about a time you took a chance on a stranger and it completely changed your life. Until next time, remember to speak up. You never know who is waiting to listen.